Before we begin tonight, a quick word of genuine gratitude to John, who suggested this story. John, this one has been sitting in the archive waiting for someone to ask the right question, and you did. If you are listening to Sleep Theories on Spotify right now, please take 10 seconds and leave us a review. 10 seconds. It costs nothing, and it changes everything for this channel. Alright, let us go somewhere dark. There is a neighbourhood in Niagara Falls, New York that no longer exists. Not in the way a neighbourhood is demolished for a highway, or abandoned after a flood. This neighbourhood was erased more quietly than that. The houses were bought up one by one, the streets were barricaded, the soil itself was declared too dangerous for human contact. A chain-link fence went up around what had been someone's backyard, someone's garden, someone's front porch where children once played on summer evenings. And then the official story was written, and the chapter was closed. The official story goes like this. A chemical company made a mistake. They buried waste. They sold the land. A school was built. Families moved in. The chemicals rose. People got sick. The government finally intervened. Lessons were learned. Regulations were passed. End of story. But there is a journalist, call him Daniel Reeves, who was not satisfied with that story. Not because the facts were wrong. They were not. The facts were accurate. What bothered Reeves was the timeline, the sequence of decisions, the pauses between actions where urgency should have existed, the way certain data was collected long before anyone was supposed to be collecting it, the way the disaster unfolded not like a tragedy, but like a process. What Reeves could not stop asking was a simple and devastating question. What if it was not a mistake? Act 1. The official story. To understand Love Canal, you have to understand what Niagara Falls was in the 1940s. It was not a tourist destination, though the falls themselves drew visitors. It was an industrial powerhouse. The falling water generated enormous amounts of electricity, and where electricity is cheap and abundant, chemical manufacturing follows. During the Second World War, the region became one of the most chemically active industrial zones in the United States. Factories lined the riverbanks. Smoke rose from refineries around the clock. The war needed chemicals, for weapons, for manufacturing, for processes that could not be named in public, and Niagara Falls provided the infrastructure to make them. Hooker Chemical Company was one of the dominant players. They were not a fringe operation. They were a legitimate, well-connected industrial firm producing chlorine, pesticides, and a range of byproducts that had no clean destination once the manufacturing process was complete. The byproducts had to go somewhere, and somewhere, in this case, was a long-abandoned canal trench on the eastern edge of Niagara Falls, a ditch that had been excavated decades earlier by a man named William T. Love, who envisioned a model city powered by diverted river water. The city never materialized. The canal sat empty, a long rectangular wound in the earth, waiting. Between 1942 and 1953, Hooker Chemical used that trench as a burial ground. They deposited over 21,000 tons of chemical waste into the earth. Dioxins, chlorinated hydrocarbons, industrial solvents, byproducts of processes so complex and so toxic that no common language existed to describe their long-term effects on living tissue. They were sealed underground, covered with a clay cap, and declared contained. The canal was full. The chapter appeared closed. Then came 1953, and the decision that would define everything that followed. Hooker Chemical sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education. The sale price was $1. One single dollar. Not because the land was worthless. Land in a growing post-war American city was not worthless, but because the transfer came with a caveat so significant that no normal buyer would have accepted it. The deed contained an explicit warning. The land contained chemical waste. The buyer accepted it in full knowledge of that fact. The legal implication was clear. Hooker was transferring not just the land, but the liability, and they were doing so with documentation that proved the buyer had been informed. A reasonable observer looking at this transaction in 1953 might have concluded that the land would be left alone. That a school board accepting contaminated land for $1 would do nothing more than fence it off, plant grass on top, and file the paperwork somewhere quiet. That is not what happened. A school was built, the 99th Street School. Construction crews broke ground directly above the buried waste. When they encountered pits of chemical residue during excavation, they reported the discovery. The construction continued anyway. By the mid-1950s, the school was open and children were attending classes. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, homes were being constructed in the surrounding blocks. Hundreds of families moved in, young couples with children, veterans who had come home from the war and wanted a yard, a neighbourhood, a piece of the post-war American dream. The houses sold, the streets filled with the ordinary sounds of domestic life. Nobody told them what was underneath. Act 2. The first signs. The chemicals did not stay still. Chemicals buried in the earth do not honour the boundaries drawn above them. They migrate, they seep, they follow the path of least resistance through soil and clay and fractured rock, and eventually they find a way to the surface, or to the water table, or to the basements of houses built on top of them. By the late 1960s, residents of Love Canal were noticing things they could not explain. An oily black substance rising in their backyards after heavy rain. A chemical smell, sharp and medicinal and wrong, drifting through neighbourhoods on warm evenings. Residue appearing on basement walls. Children coming inside with skin irritations after playing in the yard. These were not dramatic symptoms. They were the kind of slow-building wrongness that people dismiss for years before they understand what they are looking at. They called the city. They were told it was nothing serious. They went back inside. By the mid-1970s, the wrongness could no longer be dismissed. The health statistics in the Love Canal neighbourhood had begun to diverge from every surrounding area in ways that demanded explanation. Miscarriage rates among residents were elevated well above the regional average. Birth defects were occurring at a frequency that local physicians noticed and documented. Children were developing neurological symptoms, headaches, attention disorders, tremors, at ages when such things should not appear. Adults reported unexplained liver abnormalities, skin conditions, fatigue that no amount of rest could resolve. And still, the official response remained limited. The complaints were acknowledged, studies were promised, but the urgency that the situation demanded was not there. Families continued to live in the neighbourhood. Children continued to attend the 99th Street School. The contamination continued its slow migration through the soil beneath them. It was a housewife named Lois Gibbs who broke the silence wider than the government wanted it broken. Gibbs was not a scientist. She was not a lawyer or a journalist or an activist by profession. She was a mother with a sick child who started knocking on her neighbours' doors with a clipboard and a list of questions, and what she found on those streets changed the course of American environmental policy. Her neighbours were sick. Their children were sick. Their miscarriages had been silent tragedies endured in private. When Gibbs began connecting those private tragedies to a shared geography, to the specific blocks above the buried canal, the picture that emerged was undeniable. By 1978, the story was national news. Investigative journalists arrived. State health officials began conducting their own analyses. The data confirmed what Gibbs and her neighbours had been saying for years. The contamination was real, it was severe, and it had been causing harm to residents for a very long time. In August of 1978, President Jimmy Carter declared a federal emergency at Love Canal. It was the first time in American history that a federal emergency had been declared for an environmental disaster. Families were evacuated. The school was closed. The neighbourhood was cordoned off. The official investigation began in earnest. The narrative that emerged was straightforward. Corporate negligence, poor regulatory oversight, a failure of communication between private industry and local government. Love Canal became a symbol of everything wrong with industrial America's relationship to the land it used and discarded. It directly led to the creation of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, known as Superfund, which gave the federal government the authority and the funding to clean up contaminated sites across the country. Lessons were learned, regulations were passed, the chapter was closed. Daniel Reeves read that official story many times, and each time the same questions surfaced. Act 3. The investigator. Reeves was not a conspiracy theorist. He had spent years covering environmental issues with the kind of careful, skeptical methodology that distinguished serious journalism from speculation. He believed in documentation. He believed in primary sources. He believed in the principle that the simplest explanation was usually the correct one, until the evidence demanded something more complicated. He began with the timeline, because the timeline was where his unease lived. The 1940s were not just years of industrial expansion in America. They were the beginning of a period of extraordinary and largely secret government research into the effects of chemical and radiological substances on living organisms. This research was driven by the Cold War, by the recognition that the Soviet Union was developing chemical and biological weapons, and that the United States needed to understand those weapons in order to defend against them, and in order to develop its own. The research was classified, the programs were compartmentalized, and many of them, as documents declassified decades later would reveal, involved exposure of human subjects without their knowledge or consent. The names of some of these programs became well known eventually. MK-Ultra, Operation Sea Spray, the Tuskegee experiments, the radiation studies conducted on hospital patients who were told they were receiving therapeutic treatments, the spraying of bacterial aerosols over American cities to test dispersal patterns. The government, during the Cold War, had demonstrated a clear and documented willingness to expose civilian populations to harmful substances in the name of national security research. Reeves was aware of all of this. It was not speculation, it was history, confirmed by declassified documents and congressional investigations. What he began to examine was whether Love Canal fit a pattern that these other programs shared. He began with geography. Niagara Falls was not a random location for chemical research. During the Second World War, the region had been deeply integrated into the Manhattan Project's supply chain. Uranium processing, chemical refinement, the production of industrial compounds used in weapons, manufacturing, all of it flowed through the industrial corridor along the Niagara River. The infrastructure was already there, the security apparatus was already there, the relationships between private industry and government research agencies were already established. If someone in the late 1940s or early 1950s had wanted to establish a long-term chemical monitoring program in a setting with existing industrial context and government connections, the Niagara Falls region would have been a logical choice. Then there was the question of the chemicals themselves. The substances buried at Love Canal were not random industrial waste in the colloquial sense. Dioxins, specifically, were a subject of intense scientific interest during this period. They were a byproduct of chlorine chemistry, they were extraordinarily persistent in biological tissue, and their long-term health effects on human beings were almost entirely unknown. Understanding those effects had significant military value. Dioxins and related compounds were being investigated as potential components of chemical weapons. Understanding how they behaved in the human body over years and decades, what concentrations caused what kinds of damage, what the latency period was between exposure and symptom onset, how children metabolized them differently from adults, was information that the government actively wanted. Laboratory studies could provide some of this data, but laboratory studies had a fundamental limitation. They could not replicate the complexity of long-term, low-level environmental exposure in a living community across multiple generations. For that, you would need something more like a field study. Act 4. The anomaly. The decision to build the 99th Street School directly above the buried waste was the anomaly that Reeves kept returning to. It was the moment in the timeline where the official explanation of negligence strained hardest against the available evidence, because the Niagara Falls Board of Education did not proceed in ignorance. That much is documented in the deed itself. The warning was explicit. The land contained chemical waste. The board's own engineers encountered chemical residue during excavation and noted it in their records. The construction continued. The school opened. And in the years that followed, as the community developed around the school, there is no documented record of any serious internal effort to halt or reverse that development. The decision to allow families to establish permanent residence above 21,000 tons of buried industrial chemicals appears in the documentary record to have been made by committee and then simply not revisited. Reeves wanted to understand who was in those committees. He wanted to understand the relationships between the school board, the city government, the state health department, and the various federal agencies that operated in the region. What he found in the fragmentary record available to him was a web of connections that did not suggest conspiracy so much as it suggested something more unsettling. A network of institutions that each had reasons not to ask too many questions. The city government wanted development. Niagara Falls in the 1950s was a city competing for post-war population and tax revenue. Empty land was a liability. Developed land, with schools and homes and families paying property taxes, was an asset. The incentive to build was real and financial and not conspiratorial at all. But Reeves also found something else. He found references to environmental monitoring activity in the Love Canal area that predated the public health crisis by more than a decade. Air quality measurements, soil sampling, water table assessments, the kind of systematic data collection that does not happen by accident, that requires resources and methodology and sustained institutional interest. The official explanation for this monitoring was industrial safety, a reasonable and unremarkable explanation in a region with heavy chemical production. But the data being collected was specific, and it was being collected in a residential neighbourhood, not just at the industrial facilities that would have been the natural focus of an industrial safety program. Someone was watching the neighbourhood. Reeves could document the watching. What he could not definitively document was who had ordered it, or what they were looking for. He moved to the question of the delayed response. This was, to his mind, the most damning element of the official timeline, not because the delay was necessarily sinister, but because the official explanations for it were so consistently inadequate. Health complaints from Love Canal residents were formally documented as early as the late 1960s. State health officials were aware of the situation. The data linking elevated health problems to the neighbourhood's geography was not ambiguous. It was not the kind of marginal statistical noise that might require years of additional research to interpret. The correlation between residents near the buried waste and elevated rates of miscarriage and birth defects and neurological symptoms was apparent to the researchers who examined it. Yet the government response remained limited for nearly a decade after those initial complaints were filed. The standard explanation was bureaucratic inertia, the tendency of large institutions to move slowly, to require confirmation of confirmation, to pass responsibility between agencies until the problem became too large to ignore. This explanation was not implausible. Bureaucratic inertia is real and well documented, but it sat uncomfortably with Reeves alongside the evidence of proactive environmental monitoring that had been occurring in the neighbourhood for years, the same institutional network that was actively collecting data from the area was, simultaneously, failing to act on the health consequences that data revealed. The combination of active monitoring and passive response was the contradiction at the centre of his theory. AST 5. The controlled exposure hypothesis. Reeves was careful when he began to articulate what he was thinking. He was a journalist, not a polemicist. He understood the difference between raising questions and making accusations. What he had was not proof. What he had was a pattern that did not fit the official story as neatly as the official story suggested it should. The hypothesis he developed, and he framed it explicitly as a hypothesis, not a conclusion, was this. What if the Love Canal site was not simply mismanaged? What if some portion of what happened there was deliberate, not in the sense that any individual sat in a room and decided to poison a neighbourhood, but in the more bureaucratically realistic sense that certain decisions were made and certain other decisions were not made because the outcome of allowing the situation to develop served a research interest that could not be publicly acknowledged. The Cold War created specific needs. One of them was data on the long-term human health effects of chemical exposure at low concentrations over extended periods. This was not data that could be gathered in a laboratory. It required a population. It required geography. It required time. It required the kind of sustained, multi-generational exposure that only a stable residential community could provide. And it required above all that the population not know they were being observed, because knowledge of the observation would change behaviour, change the data. make the study useless as a model for what would happen if chemical agents were deployed against an unsuspecting population in a military or intelligence context. The Love Canal neighbourhood, in this hypothesis, provided all of those things: a fixed residential population, a defined geographic boundary, a buried repository of specific chemicals whose composition was fully documented, a surrounding region with established industrial context that explained the presence of chemical monitoring equipment without raising questions, and a bureaucratic structure, city government, school board, state health department, local industry, that had independent reasons to cooperate with a federal interest in keeping the situation quiet. None of this required a master conspiracy. None of it required that every official in every agency knew the full picture. The architecture of compartmentalization that the Cold War government had perfected in programs like MK Ultra meant that each participant could understand only their own portion of the operation. The school board official who approved the construction might genuinely have believed the land was safe enough, or have been told that the risks were minor and manageable. The state health official who received early complaint data and filed it without acting might genuinely have believed the situation was under review at a higher level. The federal agency that was conducting the environmental monitoring might have classified its findings as sensitive, without any individual researcher understanding why those findings were being withheld from the public health response. The machine did not require everyone to know what the machine was doing. It only required that each part function in isolation from every other part, and that the resulting data flow to a destination that the residents of Love Canal never knew existed. Reeves found this possibility more disturbing in some ways than a conventional conspiracy would have been. A conventional conspiracy requires malice and coordination, and the kind of dramatic human villainy that makes for a satisfying story. What he was describing was something more institutional, a system that had learned to extract value from human suffering not through active cruelty but through passive observation, and that had built enough bureaucratic distance between the observation and the suffering that no single person was ever required to acknowledge what they were doing. Aced 6. The data and the delay. The environmental monitoring at Love Canal deserves its own examination, because it is one of the few elements of Reeves's hypothesis that can be partially verified against the documentary record. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, various state and federal agencies conducted sampling operations in the Love Canal area. Soil cores were taken. Air quality was measured at multiple points in the residential zone. Water from the basements of homes was analysed. The results of some of these analyses were recorded in reports that existed in institutional archives, available to researchers with the patience to locate them. What the reports showed was that the contamination was extensive, well characterised, and understood by the agencies conducting the sampling. The specific chemical compounds present were identified. Their concentrations were measured. The geographic spread of the contamination, how far from the original burial site the chemicals had migrated, was documented. This was not a situation where the government was working with incomplete information and making the best decisions it could with what it had. The information was there, the picture was clear, and the public health response that this information demanded was not delivered. The most charitable interpretation of this gap between documented knowledge and inadequate response is that the bureaucratic machinery for translating environmental data into public health action was simply not functioning correctly. The agencies that conducted the sampling were not the same agencies responsible for public health response. The data travelled through institutional channels that were slow, poorly coordinated, and chronically underfunded. By the time a piece of information passed through enough hands and enough filing systems to reach someone with the authority to act on it, years might have elapsed. This explanation is plausible. It is also, if you are Daniel Reeves, deeply unsatisfying when placed alongside the evidence of how quickly and efficiently certain other kinds of information moved through those same bureaucratic channels when the institutional interest in acting on them was present. Because the Federal Emergency Declaration in 1978, once it finally came, demonstrated that the government was entirely capable of moving with speed and coordination when it chose to. The evacuation of families, the mobilization of federal resources, the establishment of a remediation program. All of it happened within months once the political pressure created by Lois Gibbs and her neighbours made inaction more costly than action. The same institutional apparatus that had spent years failing to act on clear evidence of a public health crisis was capable, under sufficient pressure, of comprehensive and coordinated response. Which means the delay was not a structural impossibility. It was a choice. Whether it was a choice made through simple negligence and misaligned incentives, or whether it was a choice made for reasons that have never been publicly stated, is the question that remains. Reeves documented a specific pattern in the health data that he found particularly striking. The diseases associated with the Love Canal contamination did not appear suddenly. They developed over time, in a progression that tracked closely with the duration of residence in the neighbourhood. Families who had lived there longest showed the most severe health outcomes. Children who had been born in the neighbourhood, whose exposure began in utero and continued through early development, showed the most significant neurological effects. This pattern, which emerged clearly in the epidemiological data once researchers began looking for it, was precisely the kind of pattern that a study of a long-term low-level chemical exposure would be designed to capture. You could not design a better longitudinal study if you tried. The population was stable, the exposure was continuous, the duration was measured in decades, the outcomes were observable and documentable, and there were researchers, Reeves found in the archival record, who were indeed documenting them, researchers whose institutional affiliations, when he traced them, connected back to federal agencies with Cold War research mandates rather than public health missions. AC-7. The Cold War Calculus. To understand why any of this would have been considered acceptable, even by the cold institutional logic of Cold War governance, you have to understand what the stakes felt like to the people making those decisions in the 1940s and 1950s. The Soviet Union had demonstrated by 1949 that it possessed nuclear weapons. The Korean War had begun. The possibility of global conflict, or not conventional war but apocalyptic, civilization-ending war, was not a theoretical abstraction. It was a daily operational reality for the people running American national security. In that context, certain calculations that might seem monstrous in retrospect had a different internal logic. If understanding the human health effects of chemical exposure could contribute to developing better defensive or offensive capabilities, then the cost of acquiring that understanding, even if the cost was borne by people who had not consented to bear it, could be rationalized as less than the cost of losing the Cold War. This was not an abstraction. It was the documented logic of programs that have since been confirmed and partially acknowledged. The radiation experiments conducted on hospital patients in the 1940s and 50s, experiments that exposed unwitting civilians and veterans to radioactive compounds in order to study absorption and health effects, were justified internally on exactly these grounds. The national security interest was deemed to outweigh the individual right to informed consent. The patients were not told what was being done to them. The data was classified. The research continued for years. If that framework was applied to Love Canal, and Reeves was careful to say that he could not prove it was, only that the evidence was consistent with the possibility, then the neighbourhood was not a crime scene. It was a resource. The families living above the buried chemicals were not victims of negligence. They were, in the coldest and most bureaucratically sanitised possible language, research subjects. Uninformed, unconsenting, unprotected, but providing data that, in the calculus of Cold War national security, had value that their individual health outcomes did not. The Cold War ended. The classified programs were partially declassified. The data was, if this hypothesis is correct, gathered, analysed, archived, and filed in the category of things that governments do in secret, and acknowledge only when forced to by the passage of time and the persistence of investigators. And the neighbourhood became a symbol of corporate negligence, which it also was, genuinely. The two things were not mutually exclusive. Hooker Chemicals' disposal practices were reckless by any reasonable standard. The city's decision to develop the land was indefensible. The health crisis was real, and the suffering was real, and the people responsible for allowing it to continue deserved the regulatory and legal consequences that eventually followed. But the question of whether that suffering also served a purpose, whether someone, somewhere, was watching it serve that purpose, was a question that the official narrative did not ask and did not answer. And Reeves believed that questions not asked in the official narrative had a way of remaining relevant long after the official narrative declared itself complete. ACET 8. What the evidence shows and does not show. Reeves was rigorous about what he could and could not claim. He documented this in his own notes, and it is worth reproducing the distinction here because it matters. What the evidence shows. The chemicals at Love Canal were deposited beginning in 1942, during a period of intense and classified government research into chemical compounds and their effects. The land was sold with documented knowledge of contamination and developed anyway. Environmental monitoring of the residential area was conducted by federal and state agencies throughout the period of active contamination. The health effects on residents were documented by those agencies, and the public health response was delayed for years despite clear evidence of harm. The federal emergency declaration and evacuation, when they finally came, demonstrated that the institutional capacity for rapid response had always existed. Several of the agencies involved in monitoring the site had concurrent Cold War research mandates related to chemical exposure and toxicology. What the evidence does not show, any single document ordering the use of Love Canal as a research site, any communication between Hooker Chemical and federal research agencies about the use of the buried waste for study purposes, any classified research report that analyses the Love Canal population as a study cohort, any individual or agency that has acknowledged, publicly or privately, that the disaster was knowingly sustained for research purposes. The gap between what the evidence shows and what it does not show is exactly the gap that has always defined the boundary between documented history and conspiracy theory. In some cases, MKUltra being the most prominent example, that gap was eventually crossed by the declassification of documents that confirmed what the evidence had suggested. In other cases, the gap simply persists because the documents either do not exist or were destroyed, or remain classified, or were never created in a form that could be traced. Reeves did not know which category Love Canal fell into. He was not certain it fell into either one cleanly. What he believed was that the pattern of the evidence warranted the asking of questions that the official narrative had not asked, and that the asking of those questions was not the same as the assertion of conclusions he could not support. He was a journalist. Asking questions was what he did. Act 9. Lois Gibbs and the uncomfortable truth. There is one more element to this story that deserves careful attention, and it involves Lois Gibbs, the woman who, more than any other single person, forced Love Canal into public consciousness and triggered the government response that evacuated the neighbourhood and launched the Superfund programme. Gibbs was not supposed to be able to do what she did. She was a young mother with no scientific training and no political connections. The institution she was confronting, city government, state health department, federal environmental agencies, had every structural advantage over her. They had lawyers, they had public relations apparatus, they had the ability to delay and complicate and obscure that all large institutions possess when confronted with inconvenient accountability. Gibbs beat them, not because she had power, but because she had data that she had collected herself, door by door, in the ordinary houses of her neighbourhood, from people who were suffering and had not yet understood that their suffering was connected to a geography rather than to individual misfortune. When she mapped those cases, when she plotted the miscarriages and the birth defects and the neurological conditions against the streets and blocks of Love Canal, the pattern was visible to anyone who looked. She made it impossible not to look. If Reeves's hypothesis has any merit, the implication for Gibbs is one of the more ethically complex elements of the story, because Gibbs was, in his reading, the variable that the system had not accounted for. The delay in government response made sense within the framework of passive observation, only if the population being observed remained stable and unorganised. A population that organises, that begins producing its own data and its own narrative and its own political pressure, is a population that has escaped the conditions of the study. Gibbs did not just expose the disaster. She arguably ended the study, because once the population was evacuated and the neighbourhood was remediated, the long-term exposure data being accumulated in those houses and those bodies was no longer accessible to whoever had been collecting it. The speed with which the government ultimately acted, once Gibbs and her neighbours had made inaction politically impossible, was consistent with this reading. The study was over. The cover story, which had always been available and which was in important ways entirely accurate, could be deployed. Corporate negligence, regulatory failure, lessons learned. The narrative of Love Canal as a cautionary tale of industrial irresponsibility was true. It was just, perhaps, not complete. Gibbs went on to found the Centre for Health, Environment and Justice, an organisation that has spent decades advocating for communities facing exactly the kind of toxic contamination that destroyed her neighbourhood. She turned her experience at Love Canal into a life's work. Whatever else the story of Love Canal contains or conceals, that part of it is unambiguous and uncomplicated. It is simply the story of what one person, refusing to accept a story that didn't add up, can accomplish when they refuse to stop asking questions. Act 10. The neighbourhood that never came back. Love Canal, as a residential neighbourhood, is gone. The houses were purchased by the government in the years following the emergency declaration. Some were demolished. The area directly above the buried waste was fenced and capped and designated a containment zone. The remediation of the surrounding area took years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was never fully complete in the sense of returning the land to a condition indistinguishable from what it had been before the contamination. In the 1980s, in an episode that generated considerable controversy, the Environmental Protection Agency declared portions of the former Love Canal neighbourhood safe for habitation and offered to sell renovated homes to new buyers at below-market prices. Some families moved in. Critics argued loudly that the remediation was insufficient and that the declaration of safety was premature at best and dishonest at worst. The debate over the safety of those homes continued for years without resolution that satisfied all parties. The area was eventually renamed Black Creek Village, as if a change of name could accomplish what remediation could not. A fresh beginning, uncomplicated by what the ground remembered. Whether it worked depended on what you believed the ground remembered and what you believed contamination meant across generational time. The 99th Street School was demolished. The site was capped. The containment infrastructure that now covers the original burial area requires ongoing maintenance, because the chemicals beneath it are still there. They will be there for generations. Dioxins in soil do not degrade on human timescales. The 21,000 tons of waste that Hooker Chemical buried between 1942 and 1953 is still present in the earth beneath the former neighbourhood, contained and monitored, but not gone. It will never be gone in any time frame that is meaningful to the people who lived there. The monitoring continues. Environmental sensors track the containment zone. Groundwater is tested. The agencies responsible for the site publish regular reports confirming that the containment is holding, that the chemicals are not migrating beyond the designated perimeter, that everything is within acceptable parameters. Someone is still watching. Whether they have always been watching, and why, is the question that the official narrative answered and the evidence has not entirely resolved. Epilogue. The question that remains. The Love Canal disaster changed American environmental law permanently. The Superfund legislation it inspired has cleaned up more than 1,500 contaminated sites across the country. The regulatory framework it helped create, requiring environmental impact assessments before construction, mandating disclosure of known contamination, establishing liability for remediation costs, has prevented harms that would otherwise have occurred in communities that never became famous because the protections arrived before the crisis did. That legacy is real, and it is significant, and it is the reason the official story of Love Canal ends on a note that is, if not redemptive, at least constructive. Something terrible happened. Something was done about it. Things are better now than they were before. Reeves accepted all of this. He did not dispute the genuine improvements that followed from the disaster. What he could not accept was the completeness of the official story. the sense that the final word had been written, the questions had been answered, and the only thing left to do was to incorporate the lesson and move on. Because the chemicals were known before anyone moved in. The risks were documented in the deed. The health effects were being observed by government agencies years before the government acted. The monitoring predated the crisis. The response waited for political pressure that should not have been necessary if the institutional knowledge already existed. And somewhere in the classified archives of Cold War America, if they were not destroyed, if the relevant programs were not sanitized from the record in the way that other programs have been sanitized, there may be files that contain data from the Love Canal years, data about chemical concentrations in residential soil, data about the health outcomes of a population exposed to specific compounds over specific periods, data that was collected not to protect the people of Love Canal, but to understand what happens to people who are exposed to the kinds of chemicals that governments, in their most private deliberations, have always considered as tools of war, as well as byproducts of industry. We may never know if those files exist. The declassification process is slow and selective. Programs that were never officially acknowledged cannot be officially declassified. And the people who would have known, the officials and researchers and bureaucrats who were young in the 1950s and middle-aged in the 1970s and old when the official story was being written, are mostly gone now. They took whatever they knew with them. What remains is the neighbourhood that no longer exists, the fence around the containment zone, the ongoing monitoring reports, the health histories of the families who lived there scattered now across the country, some of them still dealing with the long tail of the exposure they did not know they were enduring, and the question that Reeves could not answer, and that the official story never asked, whether the disaster was a failure of corporate responsibility, of regulatory oversight, of the basic institutional obligation to protect the people in its care, or whether it was a study, and whether, somewhere, in the distance between those two words, between failure and study, between negligence and observation, there is a truth about what governments do when no one is supposed to be watching. Because sometimes the most dangerous experiments are the ones conducted in the open, the ones dressed in the language of accident, the ones that unfold across decades in ordinary neighbourhoods among people who have no reason to suspect that the ground beneath their feet is anything other than ground. The families of the Love Canal lived above those chemicals for years. They raised children there. They planted gardens. They went to work and came home and made dinner and had conversations they have long since forgotten about nothing in particular, the way people do in ordinary neighbourhoods. They were not supposed to know, and most of them, for most of the time they lived there, did not. Whether that unknowing was the result of institutional failure or institutional design is a question the official record cannot answer, and the surviving evidence cannot close, and that perhaps is the most troubling thing of all, not the answer, but the fact that the question is still there, decades later, waiting, exactly as the chemicals beneath that fenced and monitored and renamed piece of earth are still there, contained but not gone, patient in the way that things underground are patient, outlasting the people and the institutions and the narratives built above them. The difference between a disaster and an experiment is whether anyone was supposed to be watching. Someone was watching at Love Canal. We just do not know exactly what they were looking for. Addendum. The other communities. One of the details that Reeves kept returning to, because it complicated the narrative in ways he found productive rather than deflating, was the fact that Love Canal was not unique. It was not the only site in the post-war United States where industrial chemical waste had been buried near a residential population, and not the only site where the communities living above that waste had suffered health consequences that took years to be officially recognised. There were dozens of such sites, hundreds perhaps, depending on how broadly you defined the category. The industrial geography of post-war America was laced with burial grounds for the byproducts of the manufacturing processes that had won the war and were now fueling the consumer economy. Chemical companies, metal processors, solvent manufacturers, they all generated waste, and the regulatory framework governing the disposal of that waste was, in the 1940s and 50s, essentially non-existent. You buried it. You dumped it in a river. You put it in barrels and left the barrels in a field. nobody was checking, and even if someone had been checking, the legal authority to compel different behaviour was not clearly established. So Love Canal was in one sense representative of a much larger pattern of industrial negligence rather than the singular outrage it became in public memory. The reason it became the symbol, rather than one of many examples, was largely Lois Gibbs, the specificity of her documentation, the telegenic quality of her activism, the way her story fit the emerging narrative of environmental consciousness that was coalescing in American culture through the 1970s. The disaster was real. The person who exposed it was extraordinary. Those two things together created the kind of story that changes laws. But Reeves noticed something about the geography of the other contaminated sites that he thought was worth examining alongside his Love Canal hypothesis. Several of the most significant contaminated sites from the post-war period shared certain characteristics with Love Canal that went beyond the obvious commonality of buried industrial waste. They were located in regions with established defence industry, infrastructure. They were situated in working class or lower middle class communities whose residents had less political capital and fewer institutional resources to challenge the practices occurring near them. And several of them, when their histories were examined carefully, showed the same pattern of early monitoring activity followed by delayed response that characterised Love Canal. Reeves was not prepared to claim that every post-war contaminated site was a covert research operation. He was not, he insisted, that kind of journalist. What he was prepared to say was that the pattern he had identified at Love Canal was not anomalous in isolation. It fit within a broader landscape of relationships between industrial activity, government research interest, and residential communities that the official history of the Cold War had not fully examined. The communities in question were not, for the most part, communities with the political power to demand explanations. They were communities of working people who trusted the institutions around them to be operating in good faith, because trust in institutions was, in the 1950s and early 1960s, a defining feature of American civic culture. The Cold War required that trust. The government could not have sustained the domestic mobilization that the Cold War demanded, the civil defense preparations, the industrial conversion, the cultural consensus around national security, without a population that was broadly willing to accept that the institutions governing them were operating with the public interest in mind. That trust was not entirely misplaced. The institutions of post-war America did, in many respects, genuinely serve the public interest. But trust, as a social resource, has a tendency to be exploited by the same institutions that depend on it, and the history of the Cold War is in significant part a history of that exploitation. Programs that required public trust to operate conducted in ways that would have destroyed that trust if they had been publicly known, justified by arguments about necessity that the public was never given the opportunity to evaluate. Love Canal may be one chapter in that history, or it may not be. The evidence supports the question more than it supports the answer, but the question, Reeves believed, deserved to be asked in the same breath as the official story, rather than consigned to the margins where inconvenient questions are traditionally kept. Addendum 2. The chemicals and what they did. It is worth pausing to be specific about the chemicals themselves, because one of the ways that industrial disasters get obscured in public memory is through abstraction. The phrases chemical waste and toxic contamination are accurate but distant. They do not convey what was actually happening in the bodies of the people who lived above those buried compounds. Dioxins are among the most toxic compounds that industrial chemistry has ever produced. They are not manufactured intentionally. They are byproducts, generated in the process of producing other chlorine-based chemicals. At Love Canal, they were present in the buried waste in concentrations that modern environmental science would classify as an acute public health emergency. But in the 1960s and early 1970s, the understanding of dioxin toxicity in humans was still developing, and the doses to which the Love Canal population was exposed were not immediately lethal. They were chronic, persistent, cumulative. Dioxins accumulate in fatty tissue. Once they enter the body, they do not leave quickly. They persist in the liver, in the adipose tissue, in the blood. They interfere with hormonal signalling. the chemical communication system that regulates growth, reproduction, immune function, and neurological development. In children, whose bodies are still forming the systems that dioxins disrupt, the consequences are particularly severe. The neurological effects observed in Love Canal children, attention difficulties, developmental delays, behavioural changes, were consistent with disrupted hormonal signalling during critical developmental windows. The elevated miscarriage rates were consistent with dioxins' interference with reproductive hormonal systems. The birth defects were consistent with the disruption of the precise chemical signalling that governs embryonic development. None of this was fully understood in 1953 when the school was built. Some of it was suspected. The military interest in dioxin toxicity that existed during the period was not because the compound was believed to be harmless. It was because its effects were known to be severe and worth characterising precisely. The research interest was a function of the harm, not a denial of it. Beyond dioxins, the Love Canal waste contained benzene, a known carcinogen linked to leukemia and other blood cancers. It contained chlorinated solvents that accumulate in groundwater and persist for decades. It contained pesticide compounds and industrial reagents that had never been evaluated for long-term human health effects at the time they were buried, because the science of environmental toxicology was still in its infancy, and the regulatory apparatus that would eventually require such evaluation did not yet exist. The people of Love Canal absorbed all of these compounds through multiple pathways simultaneously, through the soil their children played in, through the air when the compounds volatilized in warm weather and drifted across the neighbourhood as an invisible chemical fog, through the water after the compounds migrated to the water table and contaminated the household wells and municipal supply lines that served the area. The exposure was not a single event. It was a continuous multi-pathway, multi-generational saturation, exactly the kind of exposure that would be most valuable to study if your research interest was in understanding what sustained low-level chemical contamination does to a human population over time. If anyone was conducting that study, the Love Canal neighbourhood between approximately 1955 and 1978 was an extraordinarily rich data set. Decades of continuous exposure data, multiple cohorts, adults who moved in as young couples and aged in place, children who were born there and developed through childhood and adolescence in the contaminated environment, infants whose exposure began before birth, a stable geographic boundary, documented chemical composition of the buried material, and an institutional monitoring presence that was collecting environmental samples throughout the period of active exposure. Reeves was not a toxicologist. He could not evaluate the scientific value of that data in technical terms. What he could evaluate was the institutional behaviour surrounding it, and what he saw there did not fit cleanly into the story of accident and neglect that the official narrative told. Addendum 3. What happened to the files? In the years following the Love Canal Emergency Declaration, a number of Freedom of Information Act requests were filed by journalists, researchers, and advocacy organisations seeking access to government documents related to the disaster. Some of those requests were fulfilled, documents were released, reports that had been sitting in agency archives were provided to requesters and entered the public record. Other requests encountered the standard institutional friction, documents that could not be located, exemptions claimed for national security reasons, materials that were identified as existing but were withheld in their entirety on grounds that their release would endanger classified programs or intelligence sources. These denials were not unusual. They were the routine texture of dealing with government archives on matters that touched national security in any way. But Reeves noted which categories of documents were withheld, and the categories included precisely the records of interagency communication and federal research activity that would have been most relevant to his hypothesis. Some documents were eventually declassified through the standard review process years later. Reeves examined the declassified material carefully. What he found was not confirmation of a deliberate research program. What he found was evidence of interagency communication about the Love Canal site that predated the public health crisis by a significant margin, and that involved agencies whose connection to Love Canal under the official narrative of corporate negligence and regulatory failure, was not self-evident. Intelligence community components had been copied on correspondence about the site. Not the EPA, which was not yet founded when some of this correspondence occurred. Not the public health, agencies whose mandate would most naturally have drawn them to a contaminated neighbourhood. Intelligence community components, Defense Department components, the kinds of institutional recipients who appear on a distribution list when the subject matter has national security dimensions that the primary agencies are not supposed to discuss in their own communications. Reeves could not prove that these distribution patterns meant what he suspected they meant. Distribution lists in government correspondence often reflect bureaucratic convention rather than operational relevance. An agency receives a copy of a document because it was once relevant to something it did, and the connection is maintained long after the relevance has expired. He acknowledged this, he documented it, and then he noted that the specific agencies that appeared on those distribution lists were these same agencies that had known research interests in chemical toxicology during the Cold War period, and moved on to the next piece of evidence. The files did not speak directly. They never do. The files that would speak directly, if they exist, are not in the declassified record. Whether they are still classified, or were destroyed in the systematic records management that followed the end of the Cold War, or were never created in the first place because the program, if there was a program, was conducted at a level of informality that left no paper trail, is something that Reeves could not determine. He found it interesting in the specific way that journalists find certain absences interesting, that the question could not be definitively closed, that the possibility could not be ruled out, that the official story, for all its apparent completeness, still left room for a different story to exist alongside it without contradiction. That room, that space between what is documented and what is denied, is where Reeves chose to end his investigation, not because he had found everything he was looking for, but because the investigation had clarified, with more precision than he had expected, exactly what was not known, and exactly why it was not known, and exactly what would be required to know it. And the answer to that last question, what would be required to know, was the kind of access to classified government archives that journalists in a democracy are not, in practice, given. The kind of access that requires either a declassification order from an administration willing to accept the consequences, or the appearance of a whistleblower willing to accept consequences of a different and more personal kind, or simply the passage of enough time that the people and the programs and the institutional interests that depended on the secrecy are no longer present to maintain it. Time, Reeves noted, was the only investigative tool he had left, and time, unlike him, was patient. Before we begin tonight, a quick word of genuine gratitude to Riding Solo, whose video idea sparked this entire investigation. If you have a topic you would love to hear explored here on Sleep Theories, drop it in the comments below. Every suggestion is read, every name remembered, and if you have 30 seconds to spare before you drift off tonight, leaving a Spotify review takes literally 10 seconds, and it means more to this channel than you could possibly imagine. It costs nothing, but it changes everything. Now, let us go somewhere dark. Let us go somewhere cold. Let us go to Paris on the last night of August 1997. There is a kind of grief that does not feel real at first. It arrives like a sound heard through water, muffled, distorted, impossible to locate. On the morning of August 31st, 1997, that feeling swept across the world in a way that had never quite happened before and has never quite happened since. Radios interrupted. Their programming. Television anchors stumbled over words they had rehearsed for disasters, but had never truly believed they would have to say. And in the streets of London, outside the iron gates of Kensington Palace, people began to arrive before the sun had fully risen. They came carrying flowers, they came carrying candles, they came carrying a grief so enormous and so disorienting that it had no proper name. The scenes at those gates became some of the defining images of the 1990s, not just in the United Kingdom, but across every country that had followed Diana's story, which by that point included most of the inhabited world. People who had never met her, and never would have met her, found themselves weeping in ways they could not entirely explain, in living rooms and offices and train carriages and churches, with the distinctive quality of tears that fall for something larger than a single person. They were weeping for Diana. They were also weeping for something she had represented, a possibility of warmth and accessibility and genuine human contact inside an institution that had long seemed designed to exclude all three. And they were weeping, though many could not have articulated this at the time, for the specific quality of loss that comes when someone is taken in the middle of becoming rather than at the end of being. Princess Diana was dead. She was 36 years old. She had died in a tunnel beneath the streets of Paris in the early hours of that Sunday morning, and the world would spend the next several days, the next several decades in fact, trying to figure out exactly what that meant. Not just in the personal sense, not just in the sense of loss and mourning and the sudden silence where her voice had been, but in a deeper, more unnerving sense, in the sense that some events refuse to settle. Some events keep moving long after the cameras have turned away and the flowers have wilted and the candles have burned to nothing. Some events carry questions inside them like seeds, and those seeds take root in the most unexpected soil. Tonight, we're going to walk through one of those events together. We're going to move slowly. We're going to be precise. We're going to honour what is known, what is disputed, what has been investigated, and what remains, even after all these years, stubbornly unresolved. This is not a story that tells you what to believe. This is a story that asks you to pay attention. Because in a world where powerful institutions shape the narratives that history eventually accepts as truth, the distance between what happened and what we are told happened can sometimes be the most important distance of all. This is the Paris Protocol. Part 1. The City of Light, the Night of Dark Paris. In late August carries a particular quality of light. The tourists have begun to thin. The Parisians who fled to the south for the summer have started returning. There is a feeling in the city at that time of year that is neither fully summer nor fully autumn, a kind of suspended breath, as if the city itself is pausing between one version of itself and another. The Seine moves slowly. The boulevards hold the last warmth of the season. On the evening of August 30th, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, and her companion Dodi Fayed arrived in Paris after several days spent aboard a luxury yacht in the Mediterranean. The trip had been covered extensively by the tabloid press, which had followed their movements with an obsessive intensity that had become, by that point, a defining feature of Diana's existence. She was, by 1997, perhaps the most photographed person on Earth. Every movement she made was documented, every expression was analysed, every relationship was dissected with a thoroughness that would have seemed extraordinary if it had not become so completely ordinary. The couple checked into the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme, a hotel owned by Dodi's father, Mohammed Al Fayed, the Egyptian billionaire and businessman who had made his fortune through a combination of shrewd investment, political networking, and an almost operatic personal ambition. The Ritz was one of the most famous hotels in the world, a place of gilded corridors and hushed discretion, where the staff had long since learned that the most important service they could provide was silence. Diana and Dodi dined at the hotel that evening. They were aware of the photographers outside. This was not a new experience for Diana. She had been navigating the presence of the paparazzi for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time she had developed an understanding of their rhythms, their predictability, the way they clustered at exits and waited with the patience of people who were paid by the image rather than by the hour. Her team discussed strategies for leaving the hotel without becoming the evening's most spectacular tabloid photograph. The decision was made to use a decoy vehicle. A second car would leave through the front entrance, drawing the photographers away, while Diana and Dodie departed through a rear exit. It was the kind of manoeuvre that had been used before. It was the kind of manoeuvre that, in the context of everything that followed, would later be examined with a microscopic intensity that no one anticipated that evening. At approximately 12:10 in the morning on August the 31st, the Mercedes S280 carrying Diana, Dodie, their bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones, and driver Henry Paul pulled away from the rear entrance of the Ritz. Several photographers had anticipated the move. They followed on motorcycles. The Mercedes accelerated. What happened next has been documented, investigated, reconstructed and disputed across dozens of official reports, independent inquiries, and thousands of pages of testimony. The broad facts are not in dispute. The Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at a high rate of speed. At some point within the tunnel, the vehicle struck the 13th pillar on the right side and crashed. The impact was catastrophic. Dodie Fayed and Henri Paul were killed at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones survived with severe injuries. Diana survived the initial crash but suffered massive internal trauma. She was pulled from the wreckage. She was still alive. And it is at this moment, this precise, agonizing moment, that the first of many questions begins to take shape. Part 2. The minutes that matter. In emergency medicine, there is a concept known as the golden hour. It refers to the period of time immediately following a traumatic injury, during which medical intervention is most likely to prevent death. The principle is widely accepted. Rapid transport to a facility capable of surgical intervention can be the difference between survival and loss. Every minute inside the golden hour matters with a precision that is almost mathematical. The French emergency medical system operates under a different philosophical framework than the systems used in many other countries. The approach, known in French as staying and playing rather than the Anglo-American load and go methodology, prioritises on-site stabilisation over rapid transport. French emergency physicians are trained to stabilise a patient at the scene before moving them, with the belief that a patient who arrives at the hospital in a more stable condition has better outcomes than one who is transported rapidly, but arrives in a deteriorated state. This is a legitimate and extensively studied approach. It has genuine medical support. It is the standard of care in France. And yet, Diana was pulled from the wreckage of the Mercedes in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at approximately 12:25 in the morning. She did not arrive at the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, located approximately 6 kilometres from the crash site, until 2 o'clock in the morning. An hour and 35 minutes elapsed between the moment she was extracted from the vehicle and the moment she was admitted to the operating theatre. Those who defend the French medical response argue, with considerable supporting evidence, that this timeline reflects the standard approach to traumatic injury stabilisation. Diana had suffered injuries, including a ruptured pulmonary vein, that required on-site assessment before she could be safely moved. The medical team treated her at the scene, stabilised her as best they could, and transported her when they judged it appropriate to do so. Those who question the timeline note that 6 kilometres, even in a major city in the early hours of a Sunday morning, should not take 95 minutes to traverse. They note that the ambulance transporting Diana stopped at least once during the journey, not far from the hospital, to allow additional medical stabilisation. They note that the total elapsed time between the crash and hospital arrival, for a distance that could be covered in 10 to 15 minutes under normal circumstances, invites questions that the official medical explanation does not entirely resolve. The French inquiry examined this timeline in considerable detail and concluded that the medical treatment Diana received was appropriate given the severity of her injuries and the standard protocols of French emergency medicine. The British inquest reached a similar conclusion. The official position is that nothing about the timeline was unusual given the circumstances. This is one of those points at which the reasonable person encounters a fork in the road. One path accepts the official explanation. The other path notes that official explanations, particularly in cases involving powerful institutions and prominent individuals, are sometimes crafted not solely to reflect truth, but to maintain stability. Neither path is inherently dishonest. Both require a form of trust. One in institutions, one in the possibility that institutions can err. Thomas Hale, the investigative journalist whose work provides the through line for tonight's exploration, spent considerable time examining this timeline. He was not, by nature or by training, a conspiracy theorist. He had spent the better part of his career debunking them. He knew the architecture of conspiratorial thinking, the way it seized on coincidences, inflated anomalies, connected dots that were only loosely related. He understood its appeal and its danger. He had written about both. But when he examined the Pont de l'Alma timeline, he found himself doing something he had not anticipated. He found himself sitting with the questions rather than dismissing them. Part 3. The woman. She was becoming. To understand why Diana's death generated the conspiracy theories it did, you have to understand who Diana was in the final years of her life. Not the Diana of the fairy tale wedding in 1981. Not the Diana of the designer gowns and the royal tours. Not even the Diana of the famous Panorama interview in 1995, where she looked directly into the camera and dismantled, with extraordinary precision and composure, the carefully maintained fiction of a happy royal marriage. You have to understand the Diana of 1997, a woman who had spent years being shaped by forces beyond her control, and had, at some point, decided to become something entirely different. By the summer of 1997, Diana had found her purpose in a way that transcended the performing functions of royalty. She had become a genuine humanitarian force, not in the limited ribbon-cutting sense that the word sometimes implies, but in the specific interventionist sense that makes certain powerful people extremely uncomfortable. The landmine campaign was the clearest expression of this transformation. Earlier that year, Diana had travelled to Angola and Bosnia to draw attention to the catastrophic human cost of anti-personnel landmines. These are not glamorous weapons. They do not appear in the kind of warfare that generates medals and monuments. They exist in the ground long after the conflict that deployed them has ended, waiting. They take the legs of children who were not yet born when the mines were laid. They destroy the agricultural land that communities depend on for survival. They kill slowly, over decades, in the most ordinary of circumstances, a farmer crossing a field, a child chasing a ball. Diana walked through minefields. She held the hands of survivors. She looked into cameras and spoke about what she had seen with a directness that cut through the diplomatic language that typically surrounds military and geopolitical matters, and her words landed. Not just on the general public, which was moved and galvanized by her presence in these places, but on policymakers and government officials who found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to explain their support for munitions that the most beloved woman in the world was standing in a minefield describing as barbaric. The British government's position on landmines at that time was not one of unconditional opposition. There were military and strategic considerations. There were alliances and obligations. There were interests in the blunt political sense of that word, which Diana's campaign complicated. She was not operating as a government representative. She was not subject to the kind of diplomatic constraints that govern official state positions. She could say things that ministers could not say. She could go places that official delegations could not go without triggering political consequences. And she could do all of this with a media attention that no government press office could manufacture. This made her, in the clinical vocabulary of political strategy, a variable that was difficult to manage. There is no evidence, there is none, that any agency or institution decided to resolve this management difficulty by arranging her death. That must be stated clearly and unambiguously. What is true is that Diana's increasing independence from the institutional frameworks that had previously defined her existence was noted, discussed, and to varying degrees, resented by people in positions of considerable power. The nature of that resentment, and the forms it took, is a matter of documented record. The intelligence community monitored her. Her communications were reportedly surveilled. Her movements were tracked. Whether this monitoring represented standard practice for high-profile individuals perceived as potential security variables, or whether it represented something more targeted and intentional, is a question that the official record does not definitively resolve. There is another dimension to Diana's evolving public role that rarely receives the attention it deserves in the conspiracy literature surrounding her death, because it is more subtle than landmines and more difficult to photograph dramatically. By 1997, Diana had developed a sophisticated understanding of how institutions, particularly the British monarchy and the governmental structures attached to it, used image and narrative as instruments of power. She had not acquired this understanding academically. She had acquired it by living inside one of the most image-conscious institutions in the world for 15 years and watching, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that survival required understanding the rules, how that machinery operated. This understanding had begun to manifest in ways that went beyond individual charitable campaigns. Diana had started building relationships with figures in the media, in politics, and in civil society who operated outside the traditional circles of British establishment influence. She was considering, in ways she had, discussed with close confidants, the possibility of using her platform in an entirely new way, not as an adjunct to royal structures, not as a former princess performing a socially approved version of public service, but as an independent agent capable of entering contested political spaces and having genuine effect. The landmine campaign was one expression of this. Her work with AIDS charities was another. But there were conversations happening in the months before her death, conversations documented in the accounts of people who knew her, about the possibility of a more systematic use of her public position to address the kinds of issues that governments prefer to handle, through diplomatic channels rather than public pressure. Housing rights, the treatment of refugee populations, economic justice in developing nations. These were not the safe, uncontroversial charities that royal figures had traditionally patronised. These were live political issues with powerful opponents, who had material interests in keeping them unaddressed. Whether Diana would have pursued these directions had she lived is unknowable. But the trajectory was visible to those who were paying attention, and in the world of institutional politics, visible trajectories are taken seriously, even when they have not yet arrived at their destination. Hale found, in his research, a recurring phrase in the accounts of people who had known Diana in her final years. They described her as someone who was finding her footing, someone who was figuring out what she was actually capable of and beginning to act on that understanding. The phrase that recurred most often was that she was just getting started, and whatever combination of sadness and political implication one reads into those words, they capture something real about where Diana was in the summer of 1997. She was not winding down, she was accelerating. Part 4. The Man She Loved. Dodi Fayed was 30, 1 year old when he died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. He was the son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, and he had grown up in a world of extraordinary wealth and considerable social ambition. He had produced films, including the Academy Award-winning Chariots of Fire, and had moved through the upper registers of international society with the ease of someone who had been raised to understand that money, properly deployed, opened nearly every door. His relationship with Diana had begun only a few months before her death, in the summer of 1997. The speed of its development attracted significant media attention, and inevitably significant speculation. Photographs of the couple together on Al-Fayed's yacht had been published by tabloid newspapers with the kind of breathless commentary that treated their relationship as the most important romantic development in years. Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, has consistently maintained that Diana and Dodi were engaged to be married at the time of their deaths. He has stated that a ring had been purchased, that the relationship was serious, and that his son's death robbed him not just of a son but of a future he had begun to imagine. The official investigations found no conclusive evidence of an engagement. Diana's close associates at the time gave conflicting accounts of how serious the relationship was. The truth of its nature, as is often the case with relationships conducted in the shadow of public scrutiny, may have been known only to the two people at its centre, neither of whom survived the tunnel. But here is where the political dimension of the relationship enters the picture. Mohammed Al-Fayed was, by the late 1990s, a figure of considerable controversy in the United Kingdom. He had owned Harrods, the famous London department store, since 1985. He had been engaged in a long-running and extremely public battle with the British establishment over his application for British citizenship, which had been refused. He had made accusations against government ministers, accusations that were, in some cases, subsequently found to have merit. He was a man who believed, with the particular intensity of someone who had experienced it directly, that the British establishment operated by different rules for different people, and that people of his background and origin were subject to a scrutiny and a scepticism that their white, aristocratic counterparts were not. Into this already charged context, the possibility of a marriage between his son and the mother of the future King of England introduced a political and social complexity that was genuinely without precedent. A Muslim man of Egyptian origin, the son of a man who had spent years in conflict with the British establishment, potentially becoming the stepfather to the heir to the British throne. This was not a development that everyone in the institutional framework of British society would have welcomed without reservation. None of this proves anything. None of this establishes a motive in the legal sense, much less evidence of a plan. But Hale found it significant that official dismissals of conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death often disposed of this dimension of the story with a brevity that seemed, to his experienced journalistic eye, slightly disproportionate to the complexity of what it was dismissing. He was not a man given to romanticising conspiracy. He was a man given to noticing when explanations moved too quickly. Part 5. The white car in the dark tunnel. Of all the physical anomalies associated with the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the one that has attracted the most sustained attention from investigators, journalists and theorists across the nearly 3 decades since the event is the white Fiat Uno. Multiple witnesses who were in or near the tunnel on the night of August 31st reported seeing a white Fiat Uno in the moments surrounding the crash. Some placed it ahead of the Mercedes. Others suggested it may have been involved in some way in the events that led to the crash, not necessarily through deliberate action, but perhaps through a sudden braking or movement that caused Henri Paul to lose control. The accounts vary in their details, as eyewitness accounts of sudden traumatic events tend to do, but their consistency on the basic detail, a small white car, a Fiat Uno, attracted the attention of investigators almost immediately. Paint transfer was discovered on the wreckage of the Mercedes. Analysis of this paint indicated that it was consistent with a white Fiat Uno manufactured in France during a particular production period. The paint transfer was real. It had been deposited during the crash sequence. The French investigation worked to identify the vehicle. CCTV footage from the area around the tunnel was reviewed. Vehicle ownership records in the Paris region were examined. Fiat Unos, matching the description, were traced and their owners interviewed. The investigation was extensive. The vehicle was never conclusively identified. This is a remarkable fact that often gets lost in the broader sweep of conspiracy narratives about Diana's death. It does not mean that the Fiat Uno was driven by an agent of some shadowy organisation. It does not mean that its presence in the tunnel was anything other than coincidental, but it means that there was physical evidence, real, analysed, documented physical evidence, of another vehicle's involvement in the crash sequence, and that vehicle was never found. In a country with the investigative resources of France, in a case of this magnitude, that absence is notable. Hale spent a considerable amount of time with this detail. He found it emblematic of something he had come to recognise in his years of investigating contested historical events. The existence of a genuine anomaly does not confirm a conspiracy, but it does establish the legitimacy of continuing to ask questions. The white Fiat Uno is not evidence of murder. It is evidence that the official account is incomplete. The difference matters. There is also the matter of a man named James Anderson, a French photographer who was known to have owned a white Fiat Uno during the period in question. Anderson had been identified by some investigators as a person of interest, partly because of his vehicle and partly because of his known associations with European intelligence networks. associations that he neither denied nor extensively explained. In 2001, Anderson's body was found in a burned car in a forest in southern France. His death was officially ruled a suicide. Anderson's white Fiat Uno had been sold before his death. The investigation into his possible connection to the Paris crash had not reached any definitive conclusion, and now he was dead. Hale included this information in his notes under a heading he titled simply, "Things that did not answer questions." Part 6. The protection that wasn't there. One of the more straightforward anomalies associated with the night of August 31st is the question of Diana's security arrangements. As a member of the British royal family, albeit a former member, following her divorce from Prince Charles the previous year, Diana had for many years been accompanied by royal protection officers. These were specially trained police officers from the Metropolitan Police's Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit, individuals who had undergone extensive training in threat assessment, defensive driving, close protection protocols, and emergency response. Their role was not ceremonial. Their role was to keep Diana alive. Following the finalisation of the divorce in August 1996, Diana had lost her official royal protection. This was not unprecedented. The provision of royal protection is based on formal threat assessments and institutional determinations of risk, and Diana's changed status meant she fell outside the standard criteria. She had been offered continued protection, and had declined it on certain occasions, preferring, as she expressed in various conversations, to have the freedom of movement that came without a permanent security detail. On the night she died, her security arrangements were handled privately, organised through the Ritz Hotel and Mohammed Al Fayed's personal security operation. The bodyguard who survived the crash, Trevor Rees-Jones, was Al Fayed's employee, not a royal protection officer. Conspiracy theorists have seized on this fact as evidence of deliberate vulnerability creation, an argument that someone arranged for Diana to be without proper protection, specifically to enable what happened in the tunnel. The more measured interpretation is that Diana had, for a considerable period before her death, chosen to operate with reduced formal security, and that this reflected her desire for independence rather than any external manipulation. Both interpretations are compatible with the available facts. Neither can be decisively proved. What can be said is that on the night Diana died, in a foreign city, in the early hours of the morning being pursued by a pack of photographers on motorcycles, the protection around her was materially less robust than what the British state had previously deemed necessary for her safety. It is worth dwelling on what professional close protection actually involves, because the gap between what Diana had and what she might have had is not merely a matter of numbers of people or vehicles. Royal Protection Officers from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Unit are trained to assess environments before entry, to identify potential threat vectors, to coordinate with local law enforcement, to plan multiple exit routes, and to make split-second decisions about vehicle speed and direction under pressure. Henri Paul, however, skilled he may have been in other respects, was not trained in these specific disciplines. The private security arrangements in place that night were not equivalent, in professional terms, to what the British state had previously deemed necessary. There is also the question of the vehicles themselves. Royal protection convoys are not simply expensive cars. They are chosen and maintained with specific performance characteristics in mind. The drivers who operate them undergo extensive training in high-speed driving under pursuit conditions, a discipline that is genuinely separate from ordinary advanced driving. Whether a different vehicle, a different driver, or a different security configuration would have produced a different outcome on the night of August 31st is something that cannot be known. But it can be noted that Diana was navigating one of the most dangerous situations Royal Protection Officers are trained to manage, a high-speed pursuit through an urban environment late at night, without any of the people or protocols specifically designed for exactly that scenario. Hale interviewed a former Royal Protection Officer who had worked with Diana in the early 1990s and had subsequently retired from the Metropolitan Police. The officer, who requested anonymity, described the events of that night in terms that were measured but unambiguous. His view was that the security arrangements in place were insufficient for the threat environment Diana was operating in, not because of any malicious intent, but because private security operations however well resourced, do not possess the training, coordination infrastructure, and institutional backing of state protection services. He expressed no view on the cause of the crash. He expressed a clear view that the protection gap was real and significant. Part 7. The Intelligence Dimension. In the years following Diana's death, a series of disclosures established, beyond any reasonable doubt, that British intelligence services had been monitoring Diana with a degree of attention that went beyond what most people would consider routine interest in a public figure. Documents released under various Freedom of Information procedures confirmed that MI5, the Domestic Intelligence Service, had a file on Diana. The existence of this file was not itself remarkable. MI5 maintains files on a great many public figures, but its nature and extent raised questions. Reports indicated that the monitoring included surveillance of her communications and tracking of her associations and movements. The United States National Security Agency, whose signals intelligence capabilities vastly exceed those of most other agencies in the world, was subsequently confirmed to have had intercepts of Diana's communications in the period around her death. This information emerged through the work of journalists and researchers who obtained partially declassified documents under American transparency laws. The intercepts existed, they were collected. What they contained, and whether they were shared with British counterparts, has not been publicly established. The question this raises is not necessarily a sinister one. Intelligence agencies monitor public figures for a variety of reasons, many of them entirely mundane by the standards of the intelligence world. Diana's international connections, her relationships with figures from various countries, her access to high-level political conversations, all of these things might reasonably attract intelligence interest without that interest constituting anything more threatening than bureaucratic coverage. But the monitoring, combined with the questions about her evolving political role, her relationship with Dodi Fayed, and the circumstances of her death, creates a context that is at minimum worth examining. Hale noted that in his experience covering intelligence matters, the standard response of agencies to public scrutiny of their activities was to describe those activities as more routine than they appeared. This was sometimes accurate, it was sometimes not. The French intelligence dimension is less well documented but equally present in the margins of the story. France in the late 1990s was navigating its own complex relationship with questions of national security, political influence, and the management of sensitive information. That a vehicle whose presence is physically evidenced in the crash wreckage was never identified suggests either a failure of French investigative capability, which strains credulity given the resources deployed, or the presence of factors that complicated the investigation in ways that were not fully disclosed. Hale did not claim to know which explanation was correct. He claimed only that both deserved consideration. Part 8. The Official Investigations. The official investigations into Diana's death were extensive by any objective measure. The French police investigation, led by Judge Hervé Stéphan, lasted 3 years and produced conclusions that have been widely accepted as thorough and professionally conducted. The investigation examined the crash, the timeline, the evidence of the white Fiat Uno, the behaviour of the paparazzi photographers who were charged with involuntary manslaughter before those charges were eventually dismissed, and the role of Henri Paul's intoxication and speed in causing the crash. The French conclusion was clear. The crash was a tragic accident caused by the reckless driving of an intoxicated chauffeur at excessive speed while attempting to evade pursuing photographers. The British inquest, conducted by Lord Justice Scott Baker, ran from 2004 through 2008 and was the most comprehensive examination of the events surrounding Diana's death ever undertaken within the British legal system. It examined tens of thousands of documents. It heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses. It examined in detail the conspiracy theories advanced by Mohammed Al-Fayed and others, including the claim that the British establishment had orchestrated the crash to prevent Diana's relationship with Dodi from producing a child. The inquest jury returned a verdict of unlawful killing caused by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuing vehicles. Operation Paget, the Metropolitan Police investigation that ran alongside the inquest process, produced a report of approximately 800 pages. one of the most detailed law enforcement inquiries in British history. It reached the same conclusion. No evidence of a conspiracy had been found. These investigations were not conducted by people who were incapable of recognising evidence of wrongdoing. They involved skilled investigators, experienced legal minds, and exhaustive documentary review. Their conclusions carried genuine weight, and yet, Hale was careful about the word yet. He had seen it misused too often, deployed as a rhetorical pivot that transformed legitimate scepticism into unfounded accusation. But in his years of covering powerful institutions, he had also learned that thoroughness and independence are not the same thing. An investigation can be conducted with complete professional integrity and still operate within unspoken constraints about what questions it is most important to answer. The conclusions of official investigations reflect, among other things, what those investigations were designed to find. This is not an accusation. It is an observation. Official investigations in cases involving powerful institutions and sensitive political dimensions are almost always more complete in some areas than others. The question is whether the gaps in official knowledge are a product of the limits of investigation or the limits of what certain people preferred to know. Part 9. The Narrative. Management Hypothesis. Here is what Thomas Hale ultimately concluded, after months of research, hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of documents, and the kind of sustained engagement with a subject that leaves marks on you whether you intend it to or not. He did not conclude that Diana was murdered. He did not conclude that a secret organisation orchestrated her death in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on the night of August the 31st, 1997. He did not conclude that Henri Paul was a spy, that the paparazzi were agents, that the white Fiat Uno was a deliberate weapon, or that the ambulance journey to the hospital was a calculated delay. What he concluded, and this is perhaps the most unsettling conclusion of all, precisely because it is the most plausible, was that powerful institutions, in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, moved with considerable efficiency to shape the narrative surrounding it, not necessarily because they had something to hide about the crash itself, but because Diana's death created a political and institutional crisis of the first order, and powerful institutions do not navigate such crises by allowing the story to develop organically. They manage it. Consider the speed with which the accident explanation was affirmed. Consider the efficiency with which conspiracy theories were publicly characterized as products of grief, rather than legitimate questions. Consider the alacrity with which the investigation conclusions were communicated in terms that closed rather than opened discussion. None of this is evidence of murder. All of it is consistent with the behaviour of institutions that are primarily focused on maintaining stability and controlling damage. The British monarchy in 1997 was facing its most serious existential crisis since the abdication. The public grief over Diana was also, in significant measure, a public expression of anger at an institution that had, in many people's estimation, treated her badly. The monarchy's survival depended, in no small measure, on a rapid and controlled response to the crisis, one that honoured Diana sufficiently to diffuse public anger, while simultaneously re-establishing institutional control over her narrative. The most durable conspiracy theories are not the ones that require the most elaborate machinery. They are the ones that require only that institutions do what institutions always do: protect themselves, manage information, and prioritise stability over full disclosure. The most sophisticated version of the question surrounding Diana's death is not did they kill her? It is what did they not tell us, and why. It is useful here to look at how institutional narrative management actually operates, not in the dramatic Hollywood sense of men in dark rooms giving explicit orders, but in the more mundane, more accurate sense of bureaucratic self-protection. When a major crisis involving a prominent individual occurs within or adjacent to a powerful institution, the first response is almost invariably to establish the most stable and least damaging explanation possible. This is not a conspiracy. It is organisational behaviour. It is the same impulse that causes corporations to issue press statements before facts are fully known, governments to characterise events as accidents before investigations are complete, and royal households to prepare public messaging within hours of a death rather than waiting for the full picture to emerge. The speed of the official response to Diana's death, the rapidity with which the accident narrative was established, the efficiency with which inquiries were characterised in advance of their completion, the speed with which figures who questioned the official account were publicly categorised as grief-stricken or irrational, followed this pattern with a precision that Hale found instructive, not because the speed itself proved anything, but because the speed revealed priorities, and the priorities revealed something about what the institutions involved most needed the story to be. The British monarchy needed Diana's death to be an accident caused by a drunk driver and reckless paparazzi. Any other explanation would have opened questions about institutional responsibility that the monarchy, in its already fragile state in 1997, could not have survived. The French government needed the crash to be a consequence of circumstances beyond French institutional control. Both governments needed the story to be closed, manageable and final, and so it became closed, manageable and final, with extraordinary speed, and in death, her story had been taken from her again, not necessarily through violence, but through the machinery of official narrative, the press statements, the inquiry conclusions, the careful framing that transformed a complex, unresolved event into a settled matter. Whether or not she was murdered, she was, in some sense, silenced, and the silence, all these years later, still echoes. Part 10. What we are left with. Tonight, as you settle into wherever you are listening to this, wherever in the world sleep is finding you, whatever hour this voice is reaching you across, consider what it means to hold an unresolved question, not to demand an answer, not to insist that a conspiracy must exist simply because the official explanation feels insufficient, but to simply hold the question open, the way a careful thinker holds any question that deserves more than easy resolution. There is a difference between conspiratorial thinking and critical thinking. The former fills gaps with imagination. The latter refuses to pretend the gaps are not there. Tonight, we have tried to practice the latter. History is not written by the people who were there. It is written by the people who control the documents, the investigations, the press releases and the archives. It is written by the people who decide which questions deserve extended examination and which questions are best characterized as the products of irrationality. History is not a neutral record. It is a curated one, and the curation is always done by someone with interests. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply an accurate one. Understanding that history is curated does not mean abandoning trust in all institutions. It means developing a more sophisticated relationship with institutional authority, one that neither accepts everything uncritically nor rejects everything reflexively, one that asks, when a story is presented as definitively settled, what would need to be true for that settlement to be completely honest, and does the available evidence support that standard of honesty? In the case of Diana, Princess of Wales, the available evidence supports this conclusion. The official account is the most likely account. The crash was almost certainly caused by the factors the investigations identified: intoxication, speed, pursuit. But the official account is not the complete account. There are elements that were not fully resolved. There are dimensions of the story that were addressed with a brevity disproportionate to their complexity. There are questions that remain open not because the answers are impossible to find, but because finding them was never made the primary objective of the institutions conducting the search. And the woman at the centre of it, the woman who had survived so much, who had found in her final years a purpose that transcended the role she'd been born into, who was just getting started, deserved a more complete accounting than she received. Not because she was a princess, but because she was a person. Because every person who dies in circumstances that generate unanswered questions deserves the sustained, honest, and genuinely independent effort to find those answers. Princess Diana died in a tunnel in Paris on the Ria last night of August 1997. She was 36 years old. She had survived a difficult marriage, a damaging divorce, the relentless surveillance of the tabloid press, the cold institutional machinery of the British monarchy, and her own considerable private battles. She had emerged from all of it with a purpose that was entirely her own, a commitment to the specific, unglamorous, desperately necessary work of bearing witness to human suffering and translating that witness into political pressure. She was becoming something that institutions do not entirely welcome and do not entirely know how to contain. And then she was gone. The official investigations say it was an accident. The physical evidence says there is at least one element of that accident, the white Fiat Uno, that was never fully explained. The intelligence record says she was being watched more carefully than most people knew. The medical timeline says that the journey from the tunnel to the hospital raises questions that the standard protocol explanation does not entirely resolve. The political context says that her independence, her relationships, and her activism had created friction with powerful forces that preferred her to remain within boundaries she had clearly decided to leave behind. None of this adds up to murder. None of this adds up to a conspiracy in the dramatic, cinematic sense. But all of this adds up to a story that is more complicated than the official account suggests. A story whose edges have been smoothed by the machinery of institutional narrative management in ways that, even after nearly 3 decades, have not been fully transparent. The history books say Princess Diana died in a car accident, but history books are written by people, and people, even the most well-intentioned ones, are shaped by the institutions they serve and the narratives they have been given permission to tell. Tonight, in the quiet before sleep, you're permitted to wonder if the full story was ever told. You're permitted to carry the question gently, the way you carry anything whose weight you cannot fully measure. And as the night settles around you, and the world outside grows still, you are permitted to drift towards sleep with the name of a woman who walked through minefields and held the hands of the dying and made powerful people uncomfortable, and who deserved, whatever happened in that tunnel, more answers than she got. Good night, sleep well, and wherever you are tonight, from London to Lagos, from Sydney to Santiago, from wherever you are reading these words into the quiet of your particular corner of the world, thank you for being here. This was the Paris Protocol. Before we descend into the sealed corridors beneath the Vatican, I want to give a shout out to Spot Boogie for suggesting this topic. If you're enjoying this investigation into what might be hidden beneath one of the most secretive institutions on Earth, please drop those hype points on this video. Seriously, it helps the channel way more than you possibly know, and it lets me know which stories resonate with you all the most. Also, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you listening from? Only if you want to share, of course, but we absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to think we've got people from every corner of the globe, all diving into these mysteries together. Alright, let's get into it. April 10th, 2023, Rome. The Vatican Library smelled the way Lucian Ferraro always imagined eternity might smell. Ancient parchment, furniture polish, and centuries of whispered prayers absorbed into stone walls. After 6 years of begging for access, 2 years of proving his credibility, and 18 months of actual work in these halls, he'd learned to appreciate the weight of history that pressed down on every researcher who entered this place. Lucian had wanted this since childhood, since the day his grandmother, a devout Catholic who attended Mass every morning, told him that the church held secrets that would make the angels weep. She'd said it casually while making pasta in her tiny kitchen in Naples, but the words had burrowed into his young mind and never left. Now 38 years old, divorced, estranged from his daughter who lived in Milan with her mother, Lucian had poured everything into his work. Historical research was all he had left. The Vatican archives represented the pinnacle of his field, the ultimate validation that his life's choices had meant something. He'd been cataloguing routine acquisition records for 3 hours when he found it. Tucked between 2 requisition forms from 1957 was an envelope that shouldn't have existed. No barcode, no classification number, just a single phrase stamped in faded red ink across yellowed paper. Archivum Subterraneum, Level 4. Lucian's hands trembled as he broke the brittle wax seal. The sound echoed in the quiet reading room, a soft crack that seemed too loud. He glanced around, suddenly paranoid, but the only other person visible was an elderly priest dozing 3 tables away. Inside was a single torn page. The edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy it but couldn't finish the job. The paper was brittle, fragile as a dried leaf. The letterhead bore the papal seal of Pope Pius XII, the 3-tiered crown above crossed keys, embossed in gold that had faded to a dull bronze. The date read June 19th, 1948. The text was brief, written in Latin with a shaky hand, as if the writer had been under tremendous stress. But 3 phrases leapt out at him, each one more impossible than the last. Objectum originis celestis, ex deserto recuperatum, an object of celestial origin, recovered from the desert. Crypta obsignata sub fundamento Sancti Petri, the sealed vault beneath St. Peter's foundation. Non licet homini comprehendere, not permitted for man to comprehend. Lucian read it twice, then 3 times, his heart hammering against his ribs. His academic mind catalogued the implications while his hands shook with something between excitement and dread. An object of celestial origin. In 1948, just after Roswell. Hidden beneath the Vatican itself. This was either the discovery of his career or an elaborate forgery. Either way, he needed documentation. He reached for his phone to photograph the document, his fingers fumbling with the lock screen. The reading room door burst open with a bang that made the dozing priest jerk awake. 2 Swiss guards in plain clothes, dark suits, no ceremonial halberds, crossed the marble floor with purposeful strides that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Behind them, a thin man in clerical black with silver-rimmed glasses approached Lucian's desk with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. "Mr. Ferraro," the man said quietly, his English accented but precise, each word chosen with care. "You found something that requires immediate return to the restricted archives." Lucian's mouth went dry. How did they know so quickly? Had the reading room been under surveillance, or had someone known the document was there, waiting for whoever found it? "I was just cataloguing the 1957 acquisitions," Lucian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This was misfiled." "We're aware." The cleric extended his hand, palm up, patient as stone. "The document, please. I should file a report. Document where it was found, proper archival procedure." "The document," the man repeated, his tone unchanged but somehow harder. "Now, Mr. Ferraro." Lucian hesitated, looking down at the yellowed page in his hands. The Latin text seemed to burn into his vision. He could feel the weight of history in that single sheet, secrets that had been hidden for 75 years. He surrendered the page. The cleric placed it in a leather folder without looking at it. closing the cover with a soft snap that sounded final as a tomb ceiling. "Your research privileges are suspended pending review," the man said, producing a laminated card from his pocket. Lucian's access badge. How did he already have it? "Please gather your belongings and exit the premises." "On whose authority?" Lucian asked, anger finally breaking through his shock. "The Holy Seas." The cleric's eyes were flat, unreadable behind his silver-rimmed glasses. "Immediately, please." One of the guards stepped closer, a subtle reminder that this wasn't a negotiation. As they escorted him through the marble corridors toward the exit, Lucian's mind raced. He hadn't photographed the document, but he didn't need to. Years of historical training had taught him to memorize quickly, to absorb details that others missed. He replayed the phrases in his head over and over. "Objectum originis caelestis, crypta obsignata, non licet homini comprehendere." They walked past reading rooms where other researchers worked in blissful ignorance, past glass cases displaying illuminated manuscripts worth millions, past frescoed walls depicting saints and angels and the glory of divine creation, all of it built on a foundation that might contain proof of something else entirely. The guards deposited him on Via della Conciliazione without ceremony, without explanation, without even a word. The morning sun felt too bright after the library's shadows, the noise of traffic and tourists jarring after the hushed reverence inside. Lucian stood on the sidewalk, tourists streaming past him towards St. Peter's Square. Families taking photos, pilgrims saying prayers, everyone seeking connection with the divine, and made a decision. Whatever they were hiding, whatever that document referenced, he would find it. He had memorized enough to begin his search, and something told him that his expulsion wasn't just about a misfiled document. They'd been too quick, too efficient, as if they'd been waiting for someone to find it, as if this was a test. Act 1. The real history of the Vatican archives. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, in an effort at transparency that fooled no one. Occupy a building tucked behind the Cortile del Belvedere, accessed through a nondescript door that most tourists walk past without noticing. To most of the world, they represent an impenetrable fortress of historical documentation spanning 12 centuries. Lucian knew better. The archives weren't just a library. They were a maze built on secrets, organised by an organisational system so Byzantine that researchers often joked it was designed to prevent discovery rather than enable it. Back in his cramped apartment in Trastevere, a fourth-floor walk-up with a view of laundry lines and satellite dishes, he spread his research across the kitchen table that doubled as his desk. The apartment was small, furnished with second-hand pieces and stacks of books that served as impromptu furniture. The walls were covered with maps of Rome, architectural diagrams, timelines he'd created for various research projects over the years. Now he created a new timeline, 1948, the year everything changed. Years of studying Vatican history had prepared him for this moment, though he'd never imagined he'd use that knowledge to investigate something so deeply buried. His doctoral dissertation had focused on Vatican diplomatic correspondence during World War II, dry academic work that had earned him respect in his field, but little excitement. Now, looking at his notes with fresh eyes, he saw patterns he'd missed before. The facts were straightforward enough, public knowledge available to any researcher willing to dig through the bureaucracy. The archives were officially founded in 1612 under Pope Paul V, consolidating documents that had been scattered throughout various papal residences for centuries. The collection grew through conquest, donation, and sometimes theft. Cardinal Scipione Borghese alone had acquired tens of thousands of documents from noble families across Italy. Today, they contained more than 50 miles of shelving, holding an estimated 35,000 volumes of catalogued materials. 53 miles of documents. That number always stuck with Lucian. 53 miles of human history, of papal bulls and diplomatic letters, of Inquisition records and banking ledgers, of everything the Catholic Church had done or witnessed for more than 1,000 years. but that was only what they acknowledged publicly. The research process itself was Kafkaesque. Researchers could access portions of the collection, but only through a Byzantine application process that required letters of reference, academic credentials, and a stated research purpose. You couldn't browse. You couldn't wander the stacks picking up interesting volumes. You had to request specific documents by name and catalogue number, which meant you had to already know what you were looking for, and many sections required special permission that was rarely, if ever, granted. Then there were the sealed sections, the archives within the archives. Lucian pulled up a file on his laptop containing notes from his dissertation research, typed late at night in the library at Bologna where he'd completed his studies. The Vatican had always maintained certain documents under restriction. Some were sealed for 75 years to protect living individuals mentioned in sensitive correspondence. Others were sealed indefinitely for security of the Church and protection of the faithful, a phrase so vague it could mean anything. But in 2020, Pope Francis had done something unprecedented. He'd opened the previously sealed archives of Pope Pius XII, covering his entire papacy from 1939 to 1958. The move was meant to address historical questions about the Church's response to the Holocaust, to show transparency, to demonstrate that the Vatican had nothing to hide. Except they did. What caught Lucian's attention were the documents that remained sealed even after that historic opening. Not many researchers noticed. Most were too busy combing through the newly available material about World War II. But Lucian had noticed because he'd tried to request certain specific files related to 1948 and been told they were administratively restricted pending further review. Administrative restriction. A bureaucratic phrase that meant someone with authority had decided these particular documents were too sensitive even for the general opening. Why? He found his answer in a footnote of an academic paper from 2021, published in an obscure Italian historical journal. A researcher named Elena Martelli had mentioned in passing that certain subsections of the Pius XII archives remained administratively restricted pending further review, with no timeline provided for future access. When Lucian had contacted her 2 years ago for his own research into Vatican-allied communications, she told him something odd over a crackling phone line from her office in Florence. They'd spoken late at night. She kept unusual hours, she'd explained, because the quiet helped her think. There's a section they don't even list in the finding aids, she'd said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper even though she was alone in her office. Old Vatican hands, the archivists who've been there for decades, they call it the basement of Index 2. I made the mistake of asking about it once. The next day, my access permissions were reviewed for procedural compliance. I was told to stop asking about it if I wanted to keep my research privileges. What's in it? Lucian had asked. I don't know, but whatever it is, they're serious about keeping it hidden. Not just sealed, denied, as if it doesn't exist. Now that memory took on new significance. The basement of Index 2, Level 4. Were they the same thing? Lucian opened a browser and started searching for anything connected to Level 4 and Vatican architecture. The search led him down a rabbit hole of building permits, construction records, and blueprints filed with Roman city authorities over the past century. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen. The Vatican wasn't just built up, reaching toward heaven with its dome and spires. It was built down, deep into the earth, into chambers that predated Christianity itself. The foundations of St. Peter's Basilica rested on ancient Roman structures, which in turn had been built over older temples and burial grounds. But there were modern excavations too, recent ones, secret ones. Act 2. The strange events of 1948. Understanding what happened in 1948 required understanding the man at the centre of it all. Pope Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, one of the most controversial and enigmatic popes in modern history. Born in Rome in 1876 to a family of Vatican lawyers, what they called the black nobility, the aristocracy who served the papal court, Pacelli had been groomed for Vatican service from childhood. He'd served as papal nuncio to Germany, watched the rise of fascism firsthand, and became Vatican Secretary of State before his election to the papacy in 1939, just 6 months before Hitler invaded Poland. His entire reign was defined by World War II and its aftermath. The moral compromises, the diplomatic silence, the complicated dance between condemning evil and protecting the Church's institutional survival. Historians still debated whether he'd done enough to oppose the Holocaust, whether his silence had been strategic or cowardly, whether he'd saved thousands through quiet diplomacy or betrayed millions through inaction. But Lucian wasn't interested in the well-documented controversies. He was interested in the gaps, the moments when the historical record went silent. He pulled up a timeline of papal activities from 1947 to 1949, compiled from the Vatican's own published records, newspaper accounts, and diplomatic cables, public appearances, encyclicals, audiences with ambassadors, meetings with cardinals, all meticulously recorded in the kind of detail that only the Vatican bureaucracy could maintain. Most popes lived lives of rigid routine, their days scheduled in 50-minute increments, every moment accounted for. Pius XII was famous for his discipline, rising at 6 for private mass, working through mountains of paperwork, meeting dignitaries, praying the rosary while walking in the Vatican gardens. But June of 1948 showed something unusual. A 3-week gap where the Pope's daily schedule simply noted private retreat and prayer at Castel Gandolfo. 3 weeks, 21 days. For a Pope whose schedule was normally planned months in advance, who maintained diplomatic contact with dozens of nations, who oversaw a church with hundreds of millions of faithful worldwide. Lucian cross-referenced this with other sources. The Italian newspapers from that period, he'd accessed digital archives from La Stampa and Corriere della Sera, made brief mentions of the Pope's retreat but nothing unusual. A few articles speculated about his health. At 72, Pius was showing his age after the stress of the war years. But then Lucian found something in the Vatican personnel records, available through various historical databases that tracked clerical assignments. During that same June period, unusual activity spiked among Vatican astronomers and members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Travel vouchers, equipment requisitions, overtime authorizations for technical staff, all clustering around the dates of the Pope's retreat. The Vatican had been running astronomical observatories since the late 1800s, when Pope Leo XIII established the Specula Vaticana to demonstrate that the Church wasn't opposed to science, that faith and reason could coexist. By the 1940s, it was staffed primarily by Jesuit scientists, men who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but who also held doctorates in astrophysics and mathematics. 2 names appeared repeatedly in the 1948 correspondence that Lucian could access: Monsignor Georges Lemaitre and Father Daniel O'Connell. Lemaitre was famous, the Belgian priest who'd first proposed what would become the Big Bang Theory back in 1927, to the consternation of scientists who thought a Catholic priest couldn't possibly understand cosmology. Einstein himself had initially rejected Lemaitre's mathematics, only to later admit the priest was right. By 1948, Lemaitre was one of the most respected cosmologists in the world, advising the Pope on scientific matters. Father O'Connell was less well known publicly, but highly influential within Vatican circles. He would later become the director of the Vatican Observatory from 1952 onward, but in 1948 he was a senior researcher specialising in spectroscopy, the analysis of light from distant stars to determine their composition. Lucian found a digitised letter dated July 7, 1948, in a collection of declassified diplomatic correspondence. It was from O'Connell to Giovanni Battista Montini, then the substitute Secretary of State, essentially the Pope's Chief of Staff. Montini would later become Pope Paul VI, but in 1948 he was the man who made the Vatican bureaucracy run. The letter was brief and formal, the kind of official memo that filled filing cabinets. Your Excellency, regarding the object brought to our attention on June 23rd, preliminary spectroscopic analysis confirms structural composition inconsistent with known terrestrial metallurgy. Father Lemaitre concurs with initial assessment. Material exhibits properties not found in standard periodic table elements. recommend highest level of discretion, and continued study under restricted access. Respectfully submitted, Father Daniel O'Connell, S.J. The object. Lucian read the letter 3 times, his coffee growing cold beside him. The language was careful, diplomatic, designed to reveal nothing to casual readers. But between the lines was something extraordinary. June 23rd. That was right in the middle of the Pope's 3-week retreat. An object with properties not found in standard periodic table elements, requiring highest discretion. He dug deeper into 1947 and 48, expanding his search beyond the Vatican. Those years buzzed with strange reports, if you knew where to look. The Roswell incident in July of 1947, the alleged UFO crash in New Mexico that the military initially confirmed, then retracted, claiming it was just a weather balloon. Multiple UFO sightings across Europe and North America, the beginning of what researchers called the modern UFO era. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of flying saucers over Mount Rainier in June 47, the Maury Island incident, the Mantell crash, strange lights over Sweden and Norway that military officials couldn't explain. The world was seeing things in the sky that didn't fit conventional understanding, and apparently the Vatican was finding things on the ground. Lucian found another thread: archaeological expeditions. In February 1948, a French-Egyptian archaeological team had been excavating near St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. The monastery itself dated back to the 6th century, built on the site where Moses was said to have encountered the burning bush. It was one of the oldest continuously operating Christian monasteries in the world. The expedition, led by the Louvre Museum in partnership with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, had been exploring Roman-era structures in the vicinity. A brief article in Le Monde from March 5th, 1948, mentioned that the team had discovered previously unknown chambers beneath ancient foundations, and had found artifacts of unusual origin requiring further study. Then nothing. The expedition was abruptly shut down in late March. No final report was ever published. The artifacts were never catalogued or displayed. Lucian tracked down everything he could find about the expedition leader, François Dubois. An accomplished archaeologist, Dubois had worked on major digs across the Middle East before and after the war, but he never published anything about the Sinai excavation. In fact, he barely worked again after 1948. He found a 1983 obituary from a regional French newspaper. Dubois had spent his final years in a village in Provence, refusing interviews, declining to discuss his career. But a former colleague, quoted in the obituary, mentioned something haunting. François changed after Sinai. He used to love talking about his work, his discoveries. After that expedition, he wouldn't discuss it. The one time I pressed him, years later over wine, he said something I've never forgotten. What we found wasn't meant to be found. The Church understood that better than we did. Some knowledge is a curse, not a gift. He never explained what he meant. The Church understood that better than we did. Lucian stood and paced his small apartment, his mind racing. The pieces were connecting across decades and continents. An archaeological team finds something strange in Egypt. The expedition is shut down. Shortly after, the Vatican receives an object that its best scientists can't explain. The Pope goes into seclusion for 3 weeks. And 75 years later, documents referencing all of it are still sealed. What had they found beneath Mount Sinai? And why was it now sitting in a vault beneath the Vatican? Act 3. The first clues of the underground. Giuseppe Momo had been dead since 1940, but his work lived on in one of the Vatican's most photographed features, the double helix staircase designed in 1932 to connect the Vatican museums to the street level. What most tourists didn't know was that Momo had designed far more than just a staircase. Lucian spent 2 days in Rome's municipal archives, requesting every building permit and blueprint filed for Vatican construction between 1930 and 1950. The Vatican was technically a sovereign city-state, but construction that involved Roman utilities or infrastructure required coordination with Italian authorities. What he found was extraordinary. In 1935, Momo had submitted plans for expanded archive storage facilities beneath the Vatican Library. The blueprints showed 4 subterranean levels extending more than 60 feet below ground. The drawings were technical and detailed. Level 1 was clearly the main archive floor, high ceilings, climate control, standard library storage. Level 2 showed denser shelving, lower ceilings, presumably for less accessed materials. But Level 3's blueprint was different. It showed a series of sealed vault rooms, each with reinforced walls marked as pressurized containment. Notation in Italian indicated specialized environmental controls and restricted access protocols. And then there was Level 4. The blueprint for the lowest level was sparse. Just a single large chamber marked Sala Indicis, Nullus Accessus. The Hall of the Index, no entry. No details about what the chamber contained. No specifications for shelving or storage. Just a rectangular space with walls marked in red ink and a single access point from Level 3. Lucian photographed every page. He needed to talk to someone who'd actually been inside. Finding a former Swiss guard willing to talk wasn't easy. The Vatican's ceremonial security force took their vows of discretion seriously, even after retirement. But Lucian had made contacts during his years researching church history. Matteo Ricci had served from 1981 to 1991, long enough to see administrations change and secrets accumulate. Now in his mid-60s, he lived in a modest house in Frascati, in the hills outside Rome. They met at a cafe overlooking the town square. Ricci was compact and fit despite his age, his eyes still carrying the watchful quality of someone trained to notice everything. He listened as Lucian explained his research in careful, general terms. "You're asking about the lower archives," Ricci said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What you need to understand is that the guard's duties include protection of materials, not just people. We rotate through different posts. Some are ceremonial, some are very much not." "Level 4?" Lucian asked. Ricci sipped his espresso. "In 10 years of service, I escorted exactly 3 people to Level 4. All of them were astronomers from the observatory. All 3 visits happened during night shifts. Each time they went down alone after we opened the seals. We waited at the Level 3 checkpoint. What did they do down there? I don't know. They never spoke about it. But I can tell you this. They all looked different when they came back up. Not frightened, exactly. Shaken. Like they'd seen something that changed how they understood the world. Did you ever see what was down there? No, but I heard something once." Ricci leaned forward. "During one of those night escorts, while we were waiting on Level 3, I heard a sound from below. Mechanical. Like a generator running, but with a different pitch. Almost like humming. It came through the ventilation system. Humming? Not continuous, intermittent, and it didn't sound like any machinery I'd heard before." He paused. One of the other guards joked that it sounded like something breathing. He was reassigned the next week. Lucian felt his skin prickle. "When was the last time someone accessed Level 4? "While I was serving, 1989, a Jesuit astronomer from Castel Gandolfo. After that night, the access protocols changed. Papal authorization required in writing. Do you know what they keep down there?" Ricci looked at him for a long moment. "Officially? No. But Vatican security operates on need to know. What I needed to know was, protect access to Level 4, trust no one without proper authorization, and never ask questions." He finished his espresso. "But in 10 years you hear things. Other guards, older staff, whispers in the mess hall. There's something down there that predates most of the collection upstairs. Something they've been keeping sealed since before I was born." "What do the whispers say it is?" "Proof," Ricci said quietly. "Proof of something the Church has been protecting the world from knowing. Act 4. The object that changed everything. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, a deathbed confession." Lucian found it in an online archive of oral histories collected by a retired American journalist named Robert Hayes. Hayes had spent the 1990s interviewing former intelligence operatives, diplomats, and clergy about Cold War secrets. One interview, conducted in 1997, with a former Vatican archivist named Monsignor Carlo Benedetti, had been labelled sensitive and embargoed until 2025. But someone had leaked it early. The audio quality was poor, but Benedetti's voice was clear enough. They brought it in through the service entrance at night, the old priest said. This was July of 48, just after the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. I was a young clerk then, working in the manuscript department. We all knew something unusual was happening because Cardinal Montini himself was there, and he never came down to the archive floors. What did they bring? Hayes asked. A container, metal, very heavy, required 4 men to carry it, about the size of a steamer trunk. It had markings on it I didn't recognise, symbols that weren't Latin, weren't Greek, weren't anything I'd studied. Where did it come from? Egypt, we were told, recovered from an expedition near Sinai. But there were rumours it had been found in a chamber that predated the monastery, predated Christianity entirely. Some said the chamber had been sealed since before the Exodus. What was inside the container? A long pause on the recording. I never saw it opened, but I helped catalogue the documentation that came with it. There were photographs, black and white, not very clear. They showed an object that looked like a sphere, maybe 30 centimetres across. The surface appeared metallic, but with a strange texture, almost organic. The photographs showed it under different types of light, and in some of them you could see symbols or writing covering its surface. Writing in what language? Unknown! The philologists couldn't identify it. One of them said it didn't match any known alphabet, ancient or modern. Another said the mathematical properties of the symbol arrangement suggested it wasn't human. The recording hissed with static. The documentation included field notes from the excavation, Benedetti continued. They'd used what was then cutting-edge technology, Geiger counters. The object was emitting radiation, but not any type they could identify. Not alpha, beta, or gamma, something else. What did the Vatican do with it? His Holiness issued a decree personally. The object was designated Custodia Angelica, the angelic custody. Everything related to it was classified at the highest level. The container was taken to a vault I'd never heard of below the regular archives. The documentation was locked away separately. Did you see the decree? Only a copy, briefly, before it too was sealed. But I remember one line very clearly. It said, "Documents and items that challenge the created order are to be sealed at the highest level, known only to the throne of Peter and those he deems necessary for the Church's protection." Challenge the created order, Hayes repeated. What does that mean? I think it means, Benedetti said slowly, that whatever they found, it contradicted the fundamental understanding of how the world was made, of humanity's place in creation, of where we came from. Are you saying it was extraterrestrial? Another long pause. I'm saying the Church believed it was important enough to hide from the world for eternity. The interview ended shortly after. Lucian sat in his apartment, the audio file playing in the background. Custodia Angelica, the angelic custody. He pulled up everything he could find about Pope Pius XII's activities in July 1948. The public record showed normal audiences, a meeting with diplomats from newly formed Israel, routine business. But Lucian found something else, a photograph from the Vatican newspaper, dated July 28, 1948. It showed Pius XII in the Vatican gardens, but the caption noted he was recovering from a brief illness that had kept him from public audiences the previous week. The Pope wasn't sick often. Medical records eventually made public showed he'd been in good health throughout that period. So why the absence? Lucian thought about the logistics. If you're the Pope, and someone brings you an object that challenges the created order, what do? You don't just lock it away. You try to understand it. You consult experts, astronomers, scientists, theologians, and you pray. Maybe a week of illness was actually a week of grappling with the implications of what had been found beneath the desert. Lucian needed to know more about the object itself. If Vatican astronomers had examined it, there might be records at the observatory. He started making plans to visit Castel Gandolfo. Act 5. What lies below Level 4. The Vatican Observatory occupied part of the papal palace at Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence in the Alban Hills. In 2014, Pope Francis had opened the palace to visitors, but the observatory itself remained an active research institution. Lucian arranged a visit under the pretense of researching the history of Vatican astronomical work. He was granted a brief tour and time with one of the senior Jesuits, Father Antonio Marchetti, who oversaw the historical archives. Marchetti was in his 70s, his cassock immaculate, his manner warm but cautious. They spoke in the library, surrounded by century-old telescopes and stellar charts. "We're proud of our history," Marchetti said. "The Church has always sought to understand God's creation through reason and observation." "I'm particularly interested in the post-war period," Lucian said. 1947 through 50. There seems to have been significant activity. "Ah, yes. Lemaitre was doing revolutionary work then, and Father O'Connell was leading important observations. Were they examining anything unusual during that time, beyond standard celestial observations?" Marchetti's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Define unusual." Lucian decided to take a risk. "I found references to an object brought to the Vatican in 48, something that required analysis by trained astronomers." The old priest was quiet for a moment, studying Lucian's face. "You're talking about the Sinai artifact," he said finally. Lucian's heart raced. "Yes." Marchetti stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens. "I shouldn't discuss this, but I'm old, and perhaps the truth deserves to see daylight eventually." He turned back. "What do you know already?" "That an object was recovered from Egypt, that it showed unusual properties, that Vatican astronomers examined it, and that the findings were sealed." "We shared data with NASA in the 70s, Marchetti said quietly. "A gesture of scientific cooperation. Some of it came from the 48 analysis." "What kind of data?" "Radiation signatures unlike anything in our reference materials. Structural analysis showing molecular arrangements that don't match known periodic table configurations. And something else." He paused. "Inside the sphere, we found a partial star map." "A map?" "Etched into the interior surface, visible only under specific wavelengths of light. It showed stellar positions, but the configuration didn't match any known region of space visible from Earth. Either it was created from a different vantage point in the galaxy, or it's very, very old and the stars have shifted." "How old?" "The metallurgical analysis suggested the object was at least 10,000 years old, possibly much older. The radiation decay rates indicated it had been sealed in that Egyptian chamber for at least 3,000 years. Lucian absorbed this. What did the Vatican conclude? Officially? Nothing. The research was classified and the object was sealed away. But unofficially, Marchetti returned to his chair, we concluded that Earth had been visited by an intelligence not of this world, sometime in deep antiquity, and that they'd left evidence of their presence. Why seal that away? Why not share it? Because of what else we found, Marchetti said. When we decoded portions of the symbols on the sphere's surface, using pattern analysis and comparative linguistic methods, we discovered something disturbing. What? The symbols seemed to reference genetic information, specifically structures that closely resembled the human genome, which we didn't even fully understand until decades later. It was as if the object contained a blueprint, or a recipe. The implications crashed over Lucian like a wave. "You're saying it showed that humans were—" "I'm saying the artifact suggested that human development may have been influenced, possibly engineered, by whoever created that sphere. And if that's true, it contradicts fundamental church teaching about divine creation. So they buried it." "They protected the faith," Marchetti corrected. "Imagine announcing to the world in 1948 that humans might be the product of ancient extraterrestrial intervention. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, during the beginning of the Cold War, when people were desperate for meaning and stability, the world would have come apart. Do you think it's still there? In the vault?" Marchetti looked at him carefully. "I think some truths are meant to remain sealed until humanity is ready for them, and I think we're still not ready." But Lucian was already planning his next move. AC6. The modern cover-up. Getting back into the Vatican archives without authorization would be impossible through conventional means. But Lucian had spent years studying the administrative structure of the Holy See, and he knew one thing. Bureaucracies, even ancient ones, ran on routine. He started by mapping the patterns. The archives closed to researchers at 6 in the evening. Regular staff departed by 7. Security made rounds every 90 minutes through the night, but there were blind spots, service corridors, maintenance access, the kinds of back channels that existed in any old building. Lucian befriended a maintenance supervisor at a cafe near the Vatican, bought him enough drinks to loosen his tongue, and learned about the utility tunnels connecting various Vatican buildings. Some dated back to medieval times, others were added during Renaissance construction, still others carved out in the 20th century for modern infrastructure. He obtained contractor coveralls and a forged work order, waited until the lunch shift change, and simply walked through a service entrance marked authorized personnel only. Inside, the Vatican was a maze of marble and shadows,